Welcome to today's webinar, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Simon Fowler, CEO of Empowering People Group, and I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting this session this morning. Before we get started, here's just a quick overview of who we are and why we're here today. EPG consists of 4 innovative tech-led companies that are on a mission to simplify employee experience and empower people to really drive business success. And today, following Labour's landslide victory in the election last week, we're back to discuss what Labour's plan to make work pay will mean for businesses and how we all need to prepare. Before we start, there's just a quick bit of housekeeping before we get into the session and a little bit more about what you can see in front of you. The screen you see is customizable, so you can drag and move the speaker and slide views to position however you want to see them. You'll find speaker bios listed in the panel next to these, where you can read a little more about the panel speakers. We've also included some resources on the topics being discussed, which you can download during the session and which we'll send out to you after the webinar too. Lastly, but not least, there is a contact us button, so you can get in touch with us at any time during the session. And if you'd like to ask a question, there's a QA comment box at the bottom of the screen. Now, obviously, we'll try and answer as many questions as we can towards the end of the session, but if we don't get to them, we'll follow up with answers after the webinar. So, let me introduce you to the rest of the panel. I'm delighted to be joined by Halborns Head of Legal, Stefan Mars. Halborns is our employment law group company, and Stefan brings his extensive employment law experience and unerring ability to simplify complicated legal speak into easy to understand business speak. Stefan, say hi.
Thanks, Simon. Delighted to be with you today.
Great, thanks, Stefan. I'm also very happy to welcome back our guest speaker, Rob Darby from 200 Degrees Coffee. Rob has over 20 independent coffee shops nationally and a roast house that has enabled him to achieve his mission of creating the perfect cup of coffee. I hope you've had your coffee, Rob, as we love the insights you brought to the last session and look forward to hearing more now.
I certainly have had my coffee, and thanks ever so much for inviting me back to join you.
No problem, and I believe straight from holiday as well, so thank you for making this time. So in this webinar, we'll be covering the employment law changes in Labour's manifesto and plan to make work pay, which promises significant changes to employment law and employee rights within the first 100 days of coming into power. As part of our previous webinar on this topic, we discussed Labour's original Green Paper, which proposed some seismic employment law reform. The plan to make work pay superseded this with the release of Labour's manifesto. So we're going to look at what's changed and what Labour's plan to make work pay, delivering a new deal for working people, really means for businesses. Between the three of us, we're going to try and give you a clear and concise summary of the need-to-know detail and the practical impact of the changes so you can get ahead of preparing for rapid change. What we will stress is that at this stage, there is not very much detail to some of the plan, so we'll need to wait to see more over the coming months. We'll also plan to return to the table again once more information is available. But for now, there's an awful lot to get through, so let's dive in. Stefan, do you want to give us a quick summary of what was discussed in our last webinar based on the original Green Paper?
Yes, certainly. At a high level, the key employment law changes Labour originally proposed, which would make the most impact, were making unfair dismissal a day one right, introducing personal liability for directors of companies who break the law or fail to comply with tribunal orders, a new right to disconnect or switch off from work so that employees aren't contacted outside of their working hours, a ban on 0 hours contracts, and eradicating qualifying periods for sick pay and parental leave, and a genuine living wage for all.
Brilliant. So Labour promised a lot of influential change as part of their Green Paper, as we know. So what's actually changed in the new plan to make work pay?
So since the last webinar, Labour's plans have changed somewhat. So here's a quick overview of what's no longer included. There's no mention of directors' liability. So previously, Labour's Green Paper included introducing tougher penalties for directors who break the law or fail to comply with tribunal orders. However, it seems that this has been removed from their plans, at least for now. There's no longer any reference to removing the Employment Tribunal award cap. There are lots of proposed changes to ET processes, including further digitisation and simplification, but removing the award cap is no longer referenced. And thirdly, the ban on 0 hours contract. What originally sounded like an outright ban has now been softened to say exploitative 0 hours contract. So it will be interesting to see how this is further clarified.
That's really interesting. So a few perhaps very welcome omissions and some softening of the original proposals, but still I think it's wise to be cautious as these could well come back onto the agenda. Rob, what are your thoughts? Are you surprised, relieved to see these omissions?
Well, I suppose you always expect change to these things, so I'm not surprised that there have been changes. The change to the director's liability, I kind of thought that wasn't a terrible idea, if I'm honest. Making directors follow through. So I'm probably a little bit surprised at that one. You do have a liability to the behaviour in the right way as a director, so I didn't think that was a particularly bad thing. I suppose the one that I think really stands out for me as probably a smart softening is the ban on 0 hour contracts. I think in so many environments they are used for the right reasons for both employer and employee. So if there is a way to manage employers who use them in a way where they do exploit employees, which I'm sure does happen too, whilst allowing it to be used in a proper fashion as well, then I think that softening probably feels like the right way to go.
Yeah, that seems very sensible. Stefan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Labour has certainly made some important concessions since the Green Paper was superseded by the Plan to Make Work Pay and the actual manifesto. It's also made it very clear that consulting fully with both business and workers will be key. So these changes perhaps demonstrate that Labour have consulted with businesses and changed their approach in some respects to remove some things that the business would have found least palatable, I guess.
Yeah, I think we've seen that in the news, haven't we, where the business community has reacted. But Labour's Plan to Make Work Pay still includes some still quite significant reform. So let's delve into the detail of this now. Stefan, should we perhaps start with Labour making unfair dismissal a day one right?
Absolutely. So yes, this is certainly going to be significant and has been making headlines in the run-up to the election. So as covered in our last session, currently employees need 2 years service in order to bring an ordinary unfair dismissal claim. And as part of Labour's 100-day promise, they have said that they will reduce the 2-year service requirement. Although there's a lot of focus on this becoming a day one right, it's probably a little misleading. What they've actually promised is that unfair dismissal will be a day one right subject to contractual probationary periods. So that means that employees will have the right to bring an unfair dismissal claim after they've passed the probationary period set out in their contract. What we don't yet know is how long a probationary period can be. We're assuming that you won't be able to have a 2-year probationary period. But other than that, we'll have to await the detail on how this will work in practice. Additionally, Labour has said that they're intending to change the time limit for bringing employment tribunal claims from the current 3 months to 6 months. So in most cases, employees will have double the amount of time they have now to decide whether they want to bring a claim. They say the changes are designed to help ensure that newly hired workers are not dismissed without reason or cause. However, it is important to note that this will not prevent fair dismissal, which includes dismissal for reasons of capability, conduct, or redundancy, or employees continuing to have probationary periods with fair and transparent rules and processes. What we're likely to see is many employers introducing longer probationary periods or extending probationary periods where they're not convinced the employee is the right fit for the business, and therefore extending the period where the employee is not able to claim unfair dismissal. This still does raise a number of challenges for employers. Firstly, we see a lot of employment contracts that aren't drafted well enough to ensure that it's clear that the employer has the right to extend the probationary period. Going forward, this needs to be spelled out really clearly. It could also lead to more employers extending the use of fixed-term contracts to give them further options to determine whether a new hire is a good fit before making their contract permanent. So a starting point for employers is to review their contracts of employment to check if the probationary period is long enough to decide if the employee is right for the business, and to make clear it can be extended and how long for. We definitely suggest making this a priority. Another point worth mentioning that we've been discussing with a number of clients is that if you're planning any reorganisations or redundancies, you might want to consider bringing those plans forward to get them implemented before these changes kick in. It will also make keeping track of employees' probationary periods even more important than it is now, as well as making sure that those probationary reviews happen on time. You'll also need to ensure that you have really good processes in place to manage performance throughout the probationary period so that you can make robust decisions about continued employment during the probationary period. You'll want to train managers on these processes so that they understand their importance.
I agree, Stefan, that there is a big topic in its own right around manager empowerment that I was discussing at a Gartner roundtable just a couple of weeks ago. Managers need to be supported with the training and resources to proactively and confidently manage people matters, both through probation periods and afterwards, to get the best from both their people and to ensure processes are correctly and compliantly followed. I think we need to address the challenge of accidental managers and provide much better support to improve experiences all round. As we've seen the stats on the significant impact proactive people management can have on reducing the number of issues that escalate to formal processes. So building on that, what's your take on this, Rob? Do you think this places a lot more management responsibility on employers to make early decisions about employee suitability?
It definitely puts a lot more emphasis on the employers to do things right. I don't think it's so much as making early decisions on suitability. I see every challenge in business as being a call to and an opportunity to do things better, and I think this is one of those challenges. So I would be saying what's the quality of the marketing of your roles? What's the quality of your role profiles you're putting out there? That's the first point at which you'll be engaging with a potential employee, and that your first moment to help that you'll ensure that someone's suitable for the role. How good is your interview process? Is that as good as it can be? Again, ensuring that you're giving yourself the best chance of having the right people. And then the induction and embedding. Do people really understand during that process what they're taken on, what's expected of them, and all of the cultures and behaviours within the organisation, and help them form the right relationships. And then I suppose the last part of that is your probationary period and the quality of management during that probationary period. And I feel that if you take this as a call to review all of those steps and to refresh your training, the quality of which you do them, and you raise your game, then this will actually end up being positive for everyone. The fact that you haven't got a 2-year period, and that's been lessened in terms of the unfair dismissal, I think is just should be treated as noise. The reality is, we're all here to do things better every day, and this is just one of those moments where we need to make sure we're doing things really well.
Yeah, just to mention another important change that Labour have pledged to introduce is to remove the waiting days for statutory sick pay. So employees will be entitled to SSP from day one, rather than having to wait the 3 current waiting days and only getting SSP from the 4th day onwards. And they've also said that this will they'll remove the lower earnings limit for SSP, which is currently £123 a week, so that all employees and workers will be entitled to SSP regardless of how little they earn. These changes together will mean that all employers will be paying out SSP every time an employee is off sick. So a greater administrative burden for employers, and also obviously more cost, given that SSP is no longer even partly funded by the government.
Thanks, Stefan. That's a really significant change to be aware of too. So let's move on to another we touched on during our last webinar, the new right to disconnect and switch off from work. Stefan, do you want to take us through what that will likely to mean in practice?
Sure. So this is based around Labour promoting work-life balance. The idea is that employees will have a right to switch off from work outside of the hours that they're contracted to work. That literally means that as their employer, you cannot contact them outside of their working hours. Obviously, we'll await the detail, but it has been softened since the Green Paper, with mention of the opportunity to have constructive conversations and work together on a bespoke workplace policy and contractual terms that benefit both parties, rather than an outright ban. It will certainly be interesting to see how this will work in practice, as there are complex contractual issues at play, especially in the increasingly flexible working world we live in today. To address this, we would recommend employers set out very clearly in their contracts what counts as working time, how flexible hours operate, and the times when extra work may be required. You'll also want to stress the importance of allowing your employees to switch off from work.
Sounds like great advice. Rob, how do you think this will be achieved in practice?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting one. I think the hard line of you do not contact your employees outside of working hours. There's some realities to that which mean that would be extremely difficult to achieve while still running an effective business. On the flip side, the need to switch off. Everyone has that need, and in order to have a productive workplace, we need to really try and respect that and ensure that we do give people some proper downtime. So in practice, I would hope that things like this are achieved through really good employee-employer communication. You understand when someone is actually on holiday. That should be a very protected time, as opposed to an evening in a week where perhaps some light contact of an evening will change the outcomes of the following day. So I hope that, as with all employer-employee relations, that this type of thing can be achieved, partly through really great documentation that people like yourselves can help support with, but also a really good relationship between employer and employee, which ought to go a long way to making sure this is done well.
Yeah, that's great, Rob. I agree completely. I think that sort of caring relationship between employer and employee will definitely see this in the right place. I mean, Labour also referenced changing to a two-part framework for employment status, with workers all having the same basic levels of protection and rights as employees, including sick pay, holiday pay, parental leave, and protection against unfair dismissal. Genuinely self-employed would remain in their own category. Everyone currently classified as workers would gain significant additional employment rights. Labour will also apparently strengthen the rights and protections to help self-employed workers, including the right to a written contract. Stefan, can you tell us a bit more about that too, and what you think it might mean for businesses?
Sure. So currently, the employment rights and protections that an individual is entitled to depend on their employment status, with employees entitled to the widest range of rights and far fewer rights for workers. So Labour is saying that they want to move to a model where all the rights that currently apply to just employees, like unfair dismissal and redundancy payments, would also apply to those currently classified as workers. If this actually comes about, it would be a really radical change. But it's a notoriously difficult area to legislate in, and many governments before have said that they were going to change the law in this area, but didn't actually end up doing it. And even the new Labour government have said that they will consult extensively before embarking on any legislative change. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens on this possible change to employment status. When we know more, we'll certainly be sending out a further update.
Thanks, Stefan. That's really helpful. So just working through the other key changes, Labour have mentioned introducing fair pay.
Yes, that's right. So as part of their plan to make work pay, Labour intend to introduce fair pay for all employers. And they say they're going to go about doing this in the following ways. So firstly, a change in the living wage. So Labour say they will make sure that the minimum wage is the genuine living wage, changing the remit of the Independent Low Pay Commission so that the level of the minimum wage better accounts for the cost of living. Labour have also promised to remove the age bands so that all adults, those 18 and above, are entitled to the same minimum wage. There will also be additional penalties for non-compliance. So then we've got equal pay. The drive towards fair pay will also see Labour implementing a regulatory and enforcement unit for equal pay, with involvement from the trade unions. And this is partly aimed at ensuring that the outsourcing of services can't be used to justify unequal pay. Then we've got an expansion in pay gap reporting. So large firms will be required to develop, publish and implement action plans to close their gender pay gaps. And to mirror gender pay gap reporting, Labour will also require publication of ethnicity and disability pay gap data for employers with more than 250 staff. This will also include large employers with more than 250 employees being expected to produce menopause action plans, setting out how they will support employees through the menopause, much like the current gender pay gap action plan. They will also strengthen protections for pregnant people by making it unlawful to dismiss a person who has taken maternity leave for 6 months after their return, except in specific circumstances. Then we've got fair tips. So Labour will strengthen the law to ensure hospitality workers receive their tips in full and workers decide how tips are allocated. And then lastly, we've got some action on unpaid internships. So the Labour government have said that they will ban unpaid internships except when they are part of an education or training.
Really interesting. So we see Labour aiming to achieve fair play for employees and to enable a lot more transparency in the pay gap reporting. Rob, as somebody working in the hospitality industry, what do you think this will mean for you?
There will be a cost. The streamlining of the living wage will inevitably cost us some money, because we do have some employees who are at the living wage minimums. That's not something that overly worries me. It's something we will have to account for within the business, and as with every sort of cost increase that we incur, that there's always a way forward. It's either through efficiencies or through its price increases, etc. In essence, I fully support it. Some of the other bits, the equal pay and pay gap reporting, that's something that 200 Degrees already does, and it's something we're very conscious of and we're working on. There aren't a lot of tips within 200 Degrees, but we do ensure that they go to the team members in the stores and nowhere else. And we, as yet, we don't use internships. But so I think the hospitality industry as a whole will see a cost, from this area. But as with all costs, that you always find a way through it. So I think looking at it positively is the only way forward.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the only way is to look at these things positively, isn't it? Stefan, can you provide us with some practical steps for employers in regard to managing fair play internally?
Yes, of course. We'd recommend the following. So firstly, having transparent pay scales for each job role and making sure those pay scales aren't too wide. Then having a clear process to determine employees' starting salaries across the business. So where you need to pay more than you usually would to attract a particular candidate, it's really important to document that for future reference. As any challenge may come many years later when no one can remember or still less prove what the justification was. And the same point is equally true for ad hoc pay rises, so those outside your annual pay review process. Again, it's really important to document why it's necessary to depart from your usual process, for instance, because an employee gets an offer from elsewhere and you need to match it to retain them in the role. And then finally, ideally, you'd have regular equal pay audits to ensure you're doing everything you can to promote fair pay and reduce the risk of equal pay claims.
Thanks, Stefan. That's really interesting. I mean, obviously, not surprisingly, another key part of Labour's plan is to focus on trade union support, with pledges to be more collaborative and improve recognition of trade unions in more businesses. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Stefan?
Sure. So Labour plans to repeal the Trade Union Act 2016, the Minimum Service Level Strikes Bill, and the Conduct of Employment Agencies and Employment Businesses Amendment Regulations 2022. And pledges to remove what they refer to as the antiquated rule that means that unions must show that at least 50% of workers are likely to support their claim for recognition. Labour will also change the rules governing the final ballot in which workers vote on whether to recognise a trade union, requiring unions to gain a simple majority to win. They also plan to enable the gig economy to have better access to organised through trade unions. So this is all part of Labour's plan to strengthen the rights of workers and enhance representation by trade unions. It will include a duty on employers to inform new employers of their right to join a trade union and set out what this entails. So in terms of practical takeaways, for employers who don't currently have any mechanism for collective dialogue with employees in place, something like an employee forum, now would be a good time to set this up to hopefully get ahead of the likely forthcoming changes and avoid having a mechanism forced upon you that doesn't really work for your business.
Stefan, I was wondering, do we have any clarity on when these changes might actually come into force?
Yes and no. So we do have some idea, but not full clarity at this stage. What the government have said is that they are committed to introduce legislation within 100 days of taking power, which takes us to the 12th of October this year. And then once we factor in getting the legislation through Parliament and some time for employers to be notified about significant forthcoming changes, I'd have thought that we're likely to be looking at probably April 2025 before any significant new measures come in.
Thank you, Stefan. That's really interesting. I think we've now been through all the topics we were planning to cover in today's session. So I'd like to move on, and we've had a few questions come through. So let's just take a look. So the first question, the change to statutory sick pay seems pretty significant, with all employees and workers being entitled to SSP from day one, rather than having 3 waiting days and only getting SSP from day 4. Stefan, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so I think this is going to be a significant change. For those employers who don't currently offer any company sick pay over and above SSP, I'd expect that they are likely to be looking at an increase in the number of periods of short-term sickness being taken by employees, given that all sickness absence will now be paid, albeit at the SSP level. So this is going to make, for example, proactive sickness absence management even more important. So 2 key things we'd recommend on that. Firstly, having a back-to-work meeting with the employee's manager after every period of sickness absence. And this really helps to concentrate employees' minds about whether to call in sick in borderline cases, and also enables managers and employers to spot trends and patterns in sickness absence. Secondly, having really clear sickness absence triggers that are publicised to employees across the business, so that when employees hit those triggers, they're invited to a sickness absence review meeting that normally results in a formal. And these 2 measures combined are proven to have an effect in reducing the level of sickness absence across the group.
That's great, Stefan. Thanks very much. So second question, the day 1 right will have far-reaching impact, and I imagine could lead to a big increase in tribunals. How do we prepare for that? I think if my 2 colleagues don't mind, I think I can cover that. It's an area we have significant experience in. For me, this does sound like it could open the floodgates to far more tribunals, which will absolutely have far-reaching impacts on everything from productivity to costs. What we know from our experience as employee relations transformation specialists is that better management empowerment and digitalization of ER processes can actually reduce the volume of employment tribunals. So now is a time to look at your employee relations provisions to assess whether there is a risk should the volume of employee relations case actually increase. As an example, from one of our customers, the retail giant Wix, we recently did a case study that showed that they saw a 50% drop in tribunal claims because of the transformation they undertook, which guides managers through processes and ensures a full audit trail is available. This is a whole topic in its own right, and I'm planning another webinar to cover this in much more detail. And if you'd like to know more about that, then please do contact us. I think we've got time for one more question. And Rob, this sounds like one for you. Are your employees already making any noise about some of these changes? And how are you handling those conversations, particularly about day 1 rights? Are you thinking about making changes ahead of them becoming law?
We haven't had specifically people within the business coming and asking us questions, but it has become a talking point for the leadership team, and it's certainly something where everyone is starting to try and understand what the changes might be, and making sure that we have a good understanding of how we might handle things in the future. And are we going to make any changes ahead of them becoming law? Absolutely, we will. I think maybe baby steps at this stage is the way forward, rather than trying to bulldoze into something that we clearly don't quite know all the details of. But in conjunction with yourselves, I'm sure we will be making sure that we are in terms of the background paperwork and processes, we understand things, but we'll also be implementing lots of training to make sure that we're behaving in the right way, and that all our leaders are really delivering the right experience for the employees. And if we do that, then I think the impacts will be will be minimised, and we may well come out of it, as I often find with these things, a better organisation on the back of it, which is ultimately a great place to be if you're always improving.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Rob. So thank you both. That brings us to a close. As you've heard, there are some significant changes to come, and to come quickly, if Labour meets its commitment to introducing legislation within 100 days in power. So I think, as we've discussed, preparation is really key. There's obviously still a lot of detail to be confirmed on what's to come, but we will make sure we plan the next session to keep you up to date as soon as there is more colour to these plans. We really hope you found it a valuable session today. And if we weren't able to cover off your questions, we'll follow up with you personally after the session. Rob, Stefan, thank you both for your insight and practical guidance. I think a fantastic blend of both the legal side, but actually the reality of running a business. So thank you so much for that. As we touched on, all these changes will require updates and amendments to your existing people docs and templates, as well as new documents to be introduced. We've provided 2 resources to help you prepare, so you can download them in the resources section, and we'll be sending them out to you via email too. The Empowering People group is all about simple solutions to people challenges, so we're expertly placed to help with ensuring you're implementing all these changes in a really compliant and consistent manner. If there's anything you'd like our help with where we've covered it today or anything else, please get in touch using the contact form available on your screen, and we'd be absolutely delighted to chat through the solutions we have to get you where you want to be. Thank you again to everyone joining us today, some for the second time. We look forward to seeing you all on another Empowering People group webinar in the very near future. Thank you.